Yeah, we already do. Guys, all the best, huh? Can you do it from this side, please? So you can be famous.
No, don't want.
Even more reason.
Don't want.
Yeah.
I want here.
It's a quarterfinals, guys.
Exactly.
We are the team that broke last, guys. This is not quality debate room. Go to the room.
You don't even have a chair.
If you have anything.
Chair is not here yet. I see my view. I know. You must be sanctioned and answer. Yeah, that's right. You understand. By human, you type of humor, bad sanction. That's a good thing for you.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's
Yo.
Okay.
Yeah, then go take.
The chair you
Dude.
See, it's still not funny. Now you're in the bathroom.
Oh, I don't much.
Oh, the chair is bathroom. No seats.
Oh.
Okay. This is not the time of the place.
What's your team name?
Unikitty.
Unikitty.
Unikitty versus NTUnicorns.
NTUnicorns.
May the best uni win.
What's the name?
L2.
4.
NG is famous.
Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the quarterfinals of APU Pre Asians 2014. I'd like to congratulate both teams for making it this fun competition. Inside government, we have Unikitty. Inside opposition, we have NTUnicorns. What's the motion?
This house regrets the rise of big data and journalism.
On the motion, I welcome the Prime Minister.
On site government, we don't like big data, but we think it's especially bad in journalism. We regret, in particular, the way it has been used in journalism to provide a sense of authority, an unwarranted sense of authority, and to be able to push forth certain false facades and possibilities as the absolute truth. We on site Unikitty stand proud in government today. 3 main questions. Firstly, what exactly is big data? Secondly, what is journalism and why do we use big data in journalism? And thirdly, the problem with the over-reliance on statistics that we see as a result of this fetishization of big data. So firstly, what exactly is big data? Well, big data is big. It is a huge set of data collected from various sources, government sources, private sources, social media, that is that is usable by these various corporations. When journalism gets hold of it, they are able to analyze it, they are able to use it to draw forth inferences from this huge data set. We also recognize that usually big data is indecipherable. Because the data set is so huge, we are talking in terms of supercomputers, we are talking in terms of qualified data analysis in order to pull any sort of meaning out of that fall. And we therefore say that without proper resources or expertise, it's very difficult to get any meaning out of that bunch of numbers. But what this means is that if I say something and say this is supported by big data, I have my hidden data analysis crunching numbers and they have returned this result. It is very difficult for the average man on the street, because an average man on the street does not have that kind of resources or expertise or capability to prove me wrong. And therefore, when we recognize that big data has really perlocated to many various aspects of everyday life, we think that the fetishization of big data is therefore problematic and should be regretted. No, thank you, madam. Secondly, what is journalism? We recognize that journalism is a field filled with ethics. It's a balancing act between various rights, between the right to privacy and right to information, where you need to report something and upholding the truth as close as possible to reality, right? And it's therefore important to note how reporting on events is fundamentally different from using big data to push your viewpoints through. Because we recognize that when big data is used, it is used in a way that's inconsistent with this kind of journalistic ethics, with this established set of guidelines that journalists are expected to follow, right? When we talk about the role of journalism, journalists are people who go out and get stories. They are the people who go out and get reports. They're the people who tell the story that is outside that of data, right? No, thank you, madam. We recognize that we have economists, we have data analysts, and they are the people who come up and tell us, look, here are the numbers, this is what I think that we should do. But that's not the job of journalism today, right? Because we recognize that the job of journalists is to tell us the human story behind everything. A data analyst can tell me 200 people died in Rwanda, but it takes a journalist to tell me who these people were, why did they die for, and why they thought that it was worth it to die the way they did. For example, in the Arab Springs, what really drove the protest wasn't reports like, oh, 200 people protested, Tahir Square, there was X number of people. No, thank you, madam. But what really drove it was the Twitter reports of real life people on the ground tweeting their feelings, tweeting, this is what we believe, this is what we stand for. That kind of emotion, that kind of rhetoric can only come from journalism. We think that's the job of journalism, not to push forth big data. Thirdly, and most importantly, let's talk about what happens when we have over-reliance on big data. What happens when we fetishize it? Hold up on a moment, madam. We recognize Statistics 101. Correlation does not necessarily mean causation. But that's a big problem when we recognize that big data doesn't make this link clear, and when journalism has have an incentive to try to suppress that link in order to sound authoritative, in order to make it seem that they know what they're talking about, that they are omniscient, and that they have the information, you should listen to us. But before that, ma'am, you disagree.
In order to be able to weave a narrative around a trend or a story or a particular piece of information, the alternative to big data is your subjective expert witnesses.
No.
Why are they better?
We think because these subjective expert witnesses are accountable, people can see that these are witnesses, they can judge for themselves. This witness is an authoritative source, is an authoritative speaker on that subject, right? But when we talk about big data, what are you going to say? Like, I pulled it from big data. And there's no way, I've already shown you, there's no way an ordinary person like me or you who does not have like a PhD in statistics can actually pull any sort of meaning from that, right? It becomes an assertion. When journalism devolves into assertions, like listen to me because I have statistics, we don't think that's the role or the path that journalism should take. That's not a world we want to live in. So let me talk about the certain harms that come about by this over-fetishization of statistics, of statistics and the rise of big data, right? Because when we view these kind of scientific numbers and claims as true, as objectively true and scientifically accurate, for example, there is a rise in the number of Muslims in this particular population, and at the same time unemployment rate rises. And you say that that's a use of big data bringing together two unrelated things, and it's definitely possible for journalists to come and say like, look, therefore Muslims cause unemployment, you should be angry about Muslims. We think that that's especially perniciously harmful. And I'm going to talk to you about three specific reasons, three specific objective harms of the over-reliance on big data. Firstly, on journalism, we are forgetting the qualitative approach and diverging from the point of journalism in the first place. I've dedicated a large part of my substantive to telling you what journalism is about and why big data has fundamentally strayed from the path and why journalism plays such a unique and important role in our society today that cannot be filled anywhere else. If you want to get data, look for economists, not at a journalist. Secondly, this reduces accountability and transparency in the media when everything is presented as de facto truth. I've also shown you why this is particularly harmful. But importantly also, how this creates a feedback loop in policy making. When we say that journalism is used into implementing advice rather than just reporting on the situation, right? For example, in the recent US elections, when instead of having reports on what the debates were about, what you got were distilled numbers and statistics from everywhere around the country, right? When we are just reporting these numbers without giving like, oh, this is what this candidate stands for, these are his policies, and these are his beliefs, we believe that this has a negative role in influencing policy making, in influencing the kind of people that we put into government today. And we didn't think that it's singularly bad, because that's not the role of journalism, that's not what it was made for. Therefore, I've sufficiently shown you what is big data, what is journalism, and why big data has no role in it, and why the rise of big data is uniquely bad. Go with site Unikitty. Unikitty.
Opposition.
Yep. The problem with side proposition is that they never showed us a relative comparison to status quo. And they never showed us why big data is worse off than the kind of news that we see already. They said that the individual on the ground doesn't have expertise, and that's why expert witnesses are better. Really, when Fox News brings on an evolutionary biologist who says that creationism is probably false, evolution is probably false, we wonder how people on the ground who probably have nothing to do with biology or academia can ever judge the credibility of that witness in the first place. Those harms are not mutually exclusive. The way that certain news channels spin certain things is still going to happen under both paradigms. But we think that when these results are often based on big data, you allow competitors to use the same amount of data and replicate that analysis using other statisticians or their own analysis and disprove these things far more better under their paradigm when opinions are based on subjective opinions which cannot ever be disproven by fact. I have 4 arguments. Firstly, what is journalism? Secondly, what are the limitations of journalism without big data? Thirdly, what are the benefits of using big data? And fourthly, the checks and balances against all what they said. My rebuttals will be integrated, but like 2 main things that stand out. Firstly, there was this really odd argument saying that data analysis is the job of economists and analysts and not of the media. Yes, that's why media houses hire these individuals as a part of the team who go into building these stories. Media outlets still have an incentive to try and build a narrative or find causation for the data that they have. Why? Because they want to differentiate themselves from their competitors. All media channels have access to the same data, right? The public data is easily available, and all of them can hire statisticians. But they need to differentiate themselves. Like, everyone can't just be reporting that this is the numbers and this is what has happened, because that's just the same and there's no product differentiation, right? So you have an incentive to try to have analysis, and they never told us why analysis is mutually exclusive from having their data as a part of that analysis, or why this data is suddenly going to replace analysis in and of itself. But then they said, this last one, this random, saying that there's going to be like a correlation between Muslims and crime, and that's somehow going to be bad. Firstly, that automatically assumes that there is some existing correlation like that which already exists, which is automatically assumes that more Muslims do commit crimes, which is false. But secondly, we think that can already happen anyway, right? You already have channels like Fox who refer to things like previous incidents in the past, 3, 4, or 5 like terrorist attacks, and say that all Muslims cause terrorist attacks, right? Those things, confirmation biases like those, can happen under both paradigms and are not unique to big data. Why? What is journalism in and of itself? Because we think journalism has 3 roles. But the first is very obvious: to inform people and allow public access to information and the interpretation of that information. The second and third are more important. The second one is you need to allow people to understand societal problems and the causal links between the things that cause these problems and the outcomes of these problems. And the third one is how you need to act as a check and balance against state failures or measure the performance of state activity and policy. And that's where big data comes in. Big data is the aggregation and analysis of public data to draw statistical inferences. It's things like education data and employment data to find the correlation between or causation between investment in tertiary education and per capita income of individuals. It's data analysis to see, for example, how Medicare or Obamacare is affecting individuals and the rate of disease within those populations. That's the kind of thing big data is used for in journalism and extremely essential. Why is that so? And this is because of my second argument. What are the problems and limitations of journalism? Firstly, it's extremely hard to analyze social trends or causal effects of certain problems without the use of big data. It's impossible for you to go out and interview each and every individual or to find out the actual reason or cause behind certain things. There are way too many opinions and way too many people for you to interview for that to be even possible. That's why big data is really good, because big data is collected by different institutions, right? So if you want data on education, a proper government body is dedicated just to education, right? So if you want healthcare data, you have the healthcare department. It makes the job of media companies far easier rather than having to go to every different aspect. If you want health data, you interview 100,000 people and ask them about health and do a similar survey on education. That's why it's essentially important. But secondly, many social problems have more than one causal factor leading up to them. Statistical inference allows us to isolate variables, and you guys are engineers, you should know this. Statistical inference allows you to hold one variable constant while trying to change the others and finding the outcome of changing that variable, right? That allows individuals to isolate variables and actually know what the causation of certain things are, Mr. Speaker, and that's extremely important. Why is big data useful in this aspect? The first is obviously quite obvious. It allows us to aggregate data about individuals and establish important causal links. Like the fact that you need to identify social problems and the reasons which cause these social problems is extremely important. It's something I talked to you about in terms of education, investment, etc. The second is obviously more important. It allows us to actually check the actual performance of government policy. Why is this important? Like in terms of elections, right? Governments often have extremely big proposals about how they're going to increase the employment rate, for example, or how they're going to reduce diseases, or how they're going to get education to more individuals. It's exceptionally hard for individual voters to ever know the impact of that policy on everyone else. Maybe it's possible for one individual to know the impact of that policy on himself. But voters make decisions on far more other factors, right? There are certain things that you vote for which may not affect you at all, Mr. Speaker. Those things, big data allows us voters to make rational choices when they can measure the actual outcome of government policies. Like you know the input into the economy. For example, the US government is engaging in quantitative easing, right? Then you take data about employment, like the unemployment rate, and use big data to see the actual effect of that government policy so you can make more rational choices in the future. That's why big data is extremely important. Before I go on, yes.
So the problem with big data is that it gives a seemingly independent confirmation to these irrational biases. This is completely different from things like, expert witnesses of whom the veracity.
Right, okay, all right. The point of expert witnesses is there's a massive gradation of what can be an expert witness. And the problem with that is news channels get to pick the expert witnesses that they show on TV. There's a confirmation bias, Mr. Speaker. Fox News obviously has an incentive not to show evolutionary biologists like Dawkins who support things like evolution, but only pick those expert witnesses whose information obviously confirms their radical position on things like homosexuality or things like evolution. The benefit of data is it's extremely hard to manipulate data. What does this mean? The fact that this data is often publicly available means that other news channels can take the same data and that they have an incentive to do so because they're competing with each other and actually do the same statistical analysis and try to draw better results. It's far better, Mr. Speaker, because spinning by radical channels happens anyway. Confirmation bias happens anyway. The use of imagery to spark things like panic or try to support your own political agenda happens anyway when you call the expert witnesses that you want to call, when you show the pictures that you want to show, and when you write the things that you want to write in that particular way. Big data is far better because it allows far more transparency to exist within individuals because people can have the same statistical expertise and use those methods to find those conclusions. We agree that some opinions sometimes are based on misguided stereotypes which may not be true. But that's not a mutually exclusive harm, Mr. Speaker, and we give you a lot of benefits of big data. I'm extremely proud to oppose.
Deputy Prime Minister.
It isn't analysis or data that we had a beef against. What we didn't like, and what Benjamin told you in Prime Minister, was the way in which there has been a fetishization of data, of quantitative methods of statistics and analytics in the way it has permeated media today, where we accord a certain kind of authority to these statistics, that we say that these qualitative methods of analysis, qualitative methods of gathering data can never hope to replicate. It is when our society has come to rely so much on economists, on data analysts, that we think it is regrettable that journalism is following down the same trend. What we think that journalists need to do today is to be able to remember that they stood for the people, that these subjective accounts of the people were important, rather than the accounts of statistics that are permeating journalism today, that what journalists continue to report on today, day after day, continues to exactly be these statistics, rather than go out on the ground to interview these people. Mitra's speech was perfect in showing the contempt analysts have today towards these kinds of eyewitnesses, right? Because you immediately assume, and there's already that prior judgment, that there is no way the average man on the street could ever know anything these economists could not. We beg to differ. 3 things I'm talking about in my speech. The way in which we view big data and the fetishization of big data as well as manipulation. Secondly, how do we better achieve better information on policies and trends, and this is where I'll do a comparison of both our sides. And thirdly, and this is what's completely untouched by their side, on journalism ethics and the very specific codes of ethics that will surround the way in which journalists are supposed to behave, that is completely skewed the second you use big data. So let's go to how we view big data. We think that the fetishization of big data is a huge problem, as I already said in my preamble. We think that big data has got undue power over the minds that which we view the way in which we view the news today. We do not, for instance, believe that anything that you report on is important unless you can somehow find some random statistic somewhere, just as the way secondary school debaters perhaps may do the same thing, and we may make up some statistic at the end just to sound that much more convincing, because we believe and have been manipulated into believing that statistics are that important. What they fail to recognize is the manipulation of data happens easily, and far more easily as compared to bringing in those eyewitnesses that we say were important, right? Because of this fetishization of data, we are less likely to question it. It is compared to Fox News bringing in some opinion journalists saying, oh, I don't think that creationism is real, or I don't think that evolution is real. We can still question the credibility of something the second you put a human face towards it, but we always never do such a thing, because it's exactly the kind of world that Mitra wants to perpetuate, in which we don't question the numbers, in which it's impossible for the average man on the street to ever be able to form an opinion on his own the second you give these supposed objective numbers forced onto him, making him believe that this is the be-all and end-all of the debate. And that is right. Yes.
Which is easier to go unchecked? Publicly available data and its analysis, or you defining the average man by the people you choose to interview, the regions you choose to interview in?
Public data is always available. The analysis of this data is what is difficult, and is exactly what we are calling to question. Because we think that it is absolutely impossible for the average person without training in that PhD in economics to be able to challenge the dude who basically came up with this huge list of statistics and tables and complicated graphs saying that this is the way our economy is going to function in the next 10 years. We think that when Thomas Piketty, for instance, comes up and starts bringing up all sorts of models and data, it is still possible for us to question it if he is looking at things like if he looks at things beyond statistics, if he put a human figure to what these statistics are. But what happens on their side is that these journalists no longer have a name. No, it becomes a number crunching machine to just spurn out these numbers and dubious sorts of analysis that nobody really questions. They said that these numbers were neutral. We beg to differ. In the same way that every single news channel came up with a different statistic during the last presidential elections on who was popular and who was not. We think that statistics are just as easily manipulated as qualitative forms of data, but it's even harder to question and call out for due to its fetishization. Second point, who gets better information on policies and trends? This is where we really argue that your idea that we need these economists and these big data is not mutually exclusive on our side. We said that these economists exist on our side as well. We just don't think that journalists should report what these economists say wholesale because the economists are already there. We think the added role that we need to journalists isn't the big data, but it is those qualitative human and subjective experiences we want to report on. No thanks. We think that you think it's even better on our side, right? Say we take those journalists being hired from these news corporations like the BBC and everything entirely. Who do you have left? The people that you have left are those who are either economists who are hired by the state, or who are independent economists or researchers, or who are hired by the UN, by the IMF, etc. We think these are people who are less likely to be influenced if these news corporations, for instance, have any sort of political biasness or things like that. In the way that Foxconn is very clearly Republican and things like that, we can easily call them out for it. Sorry, not Foxconn, whatever. Anyways, we can easily call them out for it because they usually champion these political values. But the second they hide behind these statistics is when it's very hard to challenge that these subjective values and political affiliations have already clouded their data. Finally, let's look at journalism ethics, right? And this is where we're going to look at the idea of consent. Because the simple fact is, when a journalist says, let me quote this dude, even if this dude, I took it off Reddit or I took it off Twitter, you usually have to ask that guy, is it okay if I quote you? We think the problem with big data is that these, as we said, this is amalgamations of data that is taken out of, not just from the government, but all sorts of resources that they are able to maybe even buy off corporations, right? We think that the people had no idea that when they entered that information, when they clicked that Facebook app, for instance, that their data was going to be used against them in such a way. We think, therefore, it's inherently problematic for journalists to use big data because you're never able, for instance, to ask for the consent of the individual, unlike the way you ask him for an interview or you ask him for a quote, right? We think for these reasons, you cannot allow journalism to be tainted by this fetishization of data. We need them to be able to stand up against the analysts who claim to know everything. For these reasons, go inside government.
Deputy Leader of Opposition.
Before I begin, two clarifications. Firstly, on the idea of journalist ethics with regards to data collection. We often realize that for such data, it's collected anonymously, normally by the governments in the form of large-scale national-level census. Also, right, there are also laws and regulations on how to carry out statistical collection in an ethical way. For instance, allowing for an opt-out option for people who do not want to take the relevant surveys. So Natalie's anti-substantive does not apply. Second clarification on people just data dropping the way you name drop, right? Firstly, we realize that false legitimization, when you try and use facts or figures or ideas or interviews to justify your point of view erroneously, right, also happens under their paradigm only with qualitative data. We think this whole argument that, well, people can use facts wrongly in newspapers is an argument for not having objective data in news reports ever, and we reject that. Furthermore, we think that people who view the news, right, people actually want to know about the world, are a lot more discerning than give them credit for. Lastly, we realize that this entire point from Natalie is basically a point for good usage, good analysis of data using sound methods. And we put it to you and I'll prove to you later on. It's easier to see when data, instead of qualitative ideas, are being manipulated, especially with big data, when news and the media get access to a comprehensive batch of data on many different issues and variables around the world. I now move on to a few rebuttals. Firstly, on this idea that the media should only focus on qualitative data. They came and characterize the media as an organization that must only tell stories. We agree that media often have their own opinions. We see op-eds, right, in places like the New York Times. But there's a very, very clear distinction between fiction and subjective opinion, and the media only does the latter. In other words, the media always weaves opinions and stories from truth. The media is always founded and must be founded on the truth because people look to them for information. And such companies are always held to account should they fabricate information or lie. So the question you have to answer, therefore, is if you reject hard numbers as a way of proving the trends that you weave the stories for, do you actually have a better measure of veracity and understanding complex realities? They tell us they think the qualitative data should stand alone. But how come we don't see why interviews and other qualitative methods cannot coexist next to the big data that is rising today? We realize that the rise or even the dominance of big data in media today does not mean the death of methods like interviews. In fact, let's bring this further. Quantitative data, like big data, facilitates better qualitative storytelling of opinions within the news. So what we realize, right, is that if you have big data and you see strange outlying trends or numbers that go against the grain, it will inspire or compel news agencies to look at these unexplained numbers, to narrow down areas and variables where causation must be fully investigated. For instance, why is it a certain race has a higher correlation with crime? Is there really a causation? Do we then go and look at the qualitative aspects of microaggressions and so on? This means that you don't stop at mere wild assertions and assumptions. That is precisely why reporters do not become mere number crunching machines, but instead combine facts with stories and ideas to get a true account of what has happened. So let's look at, therefore, the idea of what the nature of big data is, right? To them, it's big. It's indecipherable. So you want numbers, find economists. That doesn't really make a lot of sense, right? Because the people expect the media to explain and inform things to them. It's, in fact, the only outlet in a moment, sir, for the common man to understand things like, say, electoral trends or so on. That is why the media should not shy away from these numbers, but instead goes on to explain it. Media reports always bring in experts to explain all sorts of data and ideas and interviews and trends. So we don't see a problem with that. Before I move on, I'll take a point.
Especially in politics, news corporations have their own motivations. They pick and choose statistics even in status quo. With big data, they can pick and choose statistics with even greater efficacy, pass them off as a gospel truth, and it's even harder for anyone to question them. That is the unique
exciting thing
of big data.
Okay. The exciting thing about big data, right, is because you have access to so much comprehensive data. And the fact that everyone knows that the way to break down data is based on certain mathematically proven objective methods. It is very hard for you to cherry pick data. Because it's very easy for other news agencies and people, no thank you ma'am, to call you out on it. Furthermore, going back to the ideal nature of big data, right? So they say we fetishize big data that we don't understand. We don't think so. I think the media is especially capable in breaking down big data. Because a media agency that cannot do so is one that will not sell papers. We see The Economist, we see BBC, we see so many news features which are able to analyze data and break it down in pie charts, in graphs, in ways that the common man on the street can and wants to understand. So we don't see the problem of fetishization they're talking about. On them, very quickly to my last rebuttal, on what Mitra has talked about, right? Mitra basically says it allows people to understand, to check, and to critique the government and war around you using data, a point that was completely dropped. He came and told you, right, that basically it allows you to understand different variables, to quantify and measure the outcomes of policies properly. Let's view on that since it was never rebutted. What we realize, right, is that it allows you to grapple with governments and institutions and maybe biased news agencies at their claims, counter narrative of statistical information. So if there are other agencies or big shots out there trying to play with data unfairly, now your media agencies are able to give you the same sort of information, same sort of clear breakdowns that allow you to challenge any unfair manipulation or cherry picking. That then brings me on nicely to my case, where we look at how you push media reporting to new standards of credibility. This will also clash with their point on how we are hurting and blinding the man on the street and this idea of calling out people who report poorly. The problem today, right, as they say, is that often, no thank you sir, often you bring in so-called experts to confer illusion of legitimacy on op-eds across different media companies. The problem is such experts under their paradigm, right, is they often have limited informational access, or they are not specialized enough or overly specialized in one small obscure field. Or what often happens, right, is say one professor is obviously Republican in his leanings and his opinions, and he's brought in but not because he's Republican, because they want to say, oh, we have a prof card to play on, where someone really really qualified, but that's not what they really bring him from. In other words, instead of giving real technocratic touch and intellectual credibility to pieces, right, you create a brand name and fake people and thinking we really have expert advice. But what does big data do? Now, any expert credentials or opinions must be based on massive raw data. So these experts are easily called out for not knowing their stuff, simply because you can't fake the process of crunching numbers. All that can be redone through methodical standards that show if things have gone wrong. We think, therefore, we refine our media to show what factual accuracy is about into a more comprehensive analysis of details and raw issues. We think, therefore, because people truly trust the media to inform them about the world around them. People trust the opinions of media to be founded on cold, hard, reliable facts. For all those reasons, therefore, with big data, we truly allow truth to be propagated. I'm extremely proud to oppose. This debate is not about the possibilities in which we can change the way big data can be used in journalism. This debate is about the ways in which big data has been used in journalism. And the reality is that we regret the way that it has been fetishized and the way in which it has changed journalism from what it used to be as a check and balance against the kind of authoritarian, utilitarian calculuses or what it means to have a successful government policy into something that's simply number crunching without a human face. I'm going to deal with this debate two main questions. Firstly, we're going to talk to you about how people really view this data and why is it that they've never really dealt with our characterization that came out from Natalie down to Benjamin about how the fetishization of this data means that all other kinds of news outlets and all other kinds of narratives will be blocked out. And then after, we'll talk to you about the kind of news that's produced and why our side does it better. So firstly, how exactly do people view this data? And we think that what they never really quite understood is that there's an over-fetishization for numbers in news outlets today, which means that audiences that see a specific number on certain sheets, or they don't even need to look at the number, they just see, no thank you sir, the fact that there are statistics in that news report and see those statistics as a holy grail to prove the authenticity and like absolute truth of that specific news report. Because these statistics are supposed to be true, supposed to be representative, no thank you sir, and supposed to be fair. The problem here is that that means that the confirmation bias that you guys were talking about is so much stronger on our side of the house, because now you have actual statistics and data to prove that confirmation bias. Let's just do a comparison then, right? Because they try to tell us that, look, all you guys are having are expert witnesses. We gave you analysis as to why expert witnesses are much better, much easily more falsifiable against than data. Because individuals who see a human being there, essentially they will doubt that human being compared to the fetishization of numbers that these individuals have. No thank you sir. But secondly, we also tell you that, look, when you're talking about expert witness, there's always going to be room for questioning because it's being presented as simply as opinion. It's presented as the opinion and findings of one individual rather than data that is seen to be seen as an absolute objective truth by everyone else. That's the fundamental difference that they never quite grapple with. No thank you sir. But secondly, let's compare the check and balances that their side tried to bring to us. Because their side said that, look, other news outlets can do the same thing, right? They can, use your data and spin new analysis on it. We don't think that's specifically the case because these journalists, and this is exactly what has happened in status quo, don't see the need or don't have an incentive to go down to your data and point out the factual inaccuracies of this data. The reason for this, no thank you sir, is very simple. Individuals in the mass public don't have an incentive, don't have the patience, and just don't care about don't care about the kind of news that talks about data collection. So rather what journalists do is simply stick to their guns
guns and stick to the kind of political ideologies or affiliations that they already pre-existing, like the pre-existing affiliations that they have. And individuals who want that confirmation bias simply stick, no thank you sir, to the news outlets that propose the kind of news that they believe in. This is specifically problematic because on the comparative, no thank you, at the very least on our side, we think that what happens is that individual news outlets can come out and bring opinion pieces that go against, no thank you sir, what is presented as the individual view of an individual. They can fight opinion against opinion of expert witnesses. But what you are doing is trying to get news outlets to fight what is essentially viewed as truth versus truth, in which case there's absolutely no way to break the deadlock. Because these things, no thank you sir, these data are seen as absolute truths. So how do we create a better discourse in this particular scenario? We think that what we necessarily have to do is that in the collision of viewpoints that these expert witnesses and these journalists have the incentive, no thank you, to to provide that in the collision of the viewpoints, even if people's views and ideologies don't change, at the very least there's now a richer and more enriched discussion as to what it actually means for these things to be like, right? That there's no objective truth, that there will be some level of trade-offs between two different kinds of opinions, rather than simply showing data that show objective truths where there's no room for compromise and no room for mediation whatsoever. That is how people view the data. But secondly, and let's move on to the second problem, is how these news are being produced. But before I move on, yes.
If we agree on premise that these numbers are going to be contradictory across different channels, does that reduce the credibility of this gospel truth in the eyes of the people?
No, because if you actually look at reality, people don't see the contradictory numbers. What people see is what their preferred news outlet is showing as numbers and seeing that data as simply being an objective truth. That's the problem with these news outlets today, right? And that's the problem Natalie already showed you in her speech. But let's move on to the second clash, right? The idea of what kind of news is specifically produced under their side. Firstly, we need to recognize something, right? Our side doesn't believe that there is such a thing as an objective truth, right? Because we told you that, like there are like a myriad of different kinds of views that can come about. But the problem is that their side try to tell you that, look, data is very hard to be manipulated, and the kind of news that's produced is going to be as close to reality as possible. We told you that that's simply not true. Like, we think that like the fact that Hui had to come out and say that cherry picking is very difficult with data proves that she just doesn't understand how journalists use this kind of data in current status quo, right? Like Natalie, the soci student who like does this on a like regular basis, will tell you that like the fact is that statisticians and people who write papers, no thank you, will like pick and choose the kind of data that they can use and the kind of data that supports their specific papers in order to produce news that supports their side of the case. But then these kind of news are no closer to whatever kind of objective truth you guys are trying to push forward than anything else. So in that case, we tell you that the kind of news that's produced now has the veneer of legitimacy and objectivity that doesn't actually exist on any side of the house. No, thank you. So, but secondly, and here's the problem that they never quite grappled with, right? Natalie brought to you the problem that what we need to do today is to change the face of journalism. That journalism has always been a check and balance against the utilitarian calculuses of governments in the ways in which they pushed out certain policies. That sometimes the success of a policy is not just about whether median income has been increasing or whether or not more people have had jobs. That sometimes journalists and the ways in which we measure the success of our policy is by going down to the ground and getting the individual stories that show that even if a majority of people have benefited from this policy, those that have not benefited are way more worse off than they were in the beginning. These are the kind of things that journalists have to go down to the ground and find out, which is eschewed under their policy, the fetishization and the kind of obsession that journalists have with simply numbers that simply correlates back to what governments want, to what governments talk about in terms of utilitarianism. It removes the last check against what we think is utilitarian policies that don't actually talk about about the human element of stories. So we think we need to change the face of journalism by moving away from big data and moving back towards what journalism was all about. For these reasons, Mr. Speaker, we oppose. Propose.
Your position will.
Side government really doesn't know what they want. Because at the end of the day, if you look at the principle behind the logic they're trying to prove to you, they're trying to prove to you that any statistic should never be used because statistics are generally bad. Yet at the same time, on their side, are willing to defend things like going onto the ground and doing their own surveys and giving their own facts and finding their own information from each media outlet. They need to decide whether statistics and objective information are actually useful to journalism at all. We think that they were confused, and we don't think that they actually had a legitimate principle or legitimate case to stand by. We're going to make one thing very clear in this debate. All stories and articles in any journalistic aspect is based on some kind of information and truth. It has to be based on some kind of foundational basis of objective fact. That is necessary in order to build your narrative, to build your stories, to give your human faces, and to get the analysis that they needed. There are two possible ways to get this objective foundational basis. One is big data. The other is your surveys, your interviews that each media outlet does for themselves, goes on the ground, interviews 10 people, creates a tiny sample size and information out of it. Which paradigm is better? We tell you that the rise of big data is actually good because it ensures that every media outlet is working on the same piece of information rather than the multiple pieces of information that just cannot be verified on that side. We're going to look at two things. One, whether the acceptance and accountability of information works better with big data or with the alternatives they wanted to talk about. Secondly, we're going to look at the concept of journalistic ethics and what really that means. Let's start with acceptance and accountability of information. This is where we tell you we really didn't understand what they wanted. Both CNN and Fox having the same access to big data meant that they have the spin on the exact same fact. That means an increased transparency and an easier ability to disprove each other's conclusions, because CNN posting something that Fox disagrees with would entail Fox going through their own statistical analysis and statistical spins of that same fact. The argument we heard from the speaker before was journalists have no incentive to call each other out. Bullshit. The point of journalism and the point of the competitive environment of media companies and the profit motive behind it is to call each other out. That's why MSNBC literally does nothing but call Fox out on a daily basis, because they know Fox spews bullshit all the time. We think that that's the point of a lot of these competitive environments in the media industry. So yes, journalists have an absolute incentive to call each other out on bullshit facts and bullshit analysis that they get from big data. But we tell you that CNN and Fox, on their paradigm, when they don't have big data, have different pools of expert witnesses that they call upon, because obviously they have their own biases that they want to create and the storylines that they want to create. Each of these expert witnesses coming from different backgrounds and having different sets of facts based on different experiences in life and based on different educational backgrounds means that they can never be verified by each other, because each other's pool of information is so inaccessible by other media outlets. We think that means that the accountability of information in the media is far worse without big data. But far more pernicious is the fact that a lot of the times these articles or these stories by CNN and Fox, when using these different pools of information, are sold just as objectively as big data is. The argument on government is that, well, big data is seen as objective, but the problem is this: your PhD in economics expert witness that comes and gives you the details and the stories behind a particular economic analysis is sold to be just as objective as big data, which means that actually you're getting subjective information with confirmation biases because of the story you want to spin being sold just as objectively as big data, meaning they change nothing on their side but actually have less accountability and less transparency because the ability to verify these expert witnesses is far lower. The argument from them was people just buy it because the word big data is in the article, so people have some switch in their head where they stop listening to credibility and rationality because the word is in the article. That's not how it works, right? People don't just buy things because there are two words in an article in a particular fashion. If that's the case, the same kind of standard applies for any statistic, big data or otherwise, on that side. The acceptance of these informations, it comes from proving logical links from objective objective standards, which is why different media outlets having different conclusions means that it's controversial, and people are less likely to buy it and think it's credible when different companies or different media outlets come to different conclusions. The response we heard from WIP was, you know what, people cannot see contradictions because they only watch one media channel. Yet that was the side that said that subject expert witnesses can be called out upon because people watch multiple channels and get different opinions from different channels. They need to decide what people really do. What is journalistic ethics? Before that, go.
Right now, everyone knows that Fox's statistics are shit. But when you give them access to big data, what they can do is they can sell this to their loyal customer base with the added legitimacy of big data. That is a unique harm on your side.
Let's make this clear. Fox's loyal customers are going to believe the subject expert witnesses too. Nothing changes. This is not about your loyal customers to Fox or your loyal customers to MSNBC. These are your people who are easily swayed, people who are in the middle, and who are rational and moderate and willing to see both sides of the picture. Why are journalistic ethics far better under outside? We think that we agree with government when they say that the duty is to put a face to stories and analyze beyond just using numbers for the sake of legitimacy. We agree that analysis is important and that analysis and interpretation of the information is why these media outlets exist and what journalistic ethics stand for. But we told you on our side that that will happen anyway, because as a media outlet, you can't just give statistics on a piece of a piece of news or an article, because every media outlet around you has the exact same information and has the exact same ability to put those information out there. The way you differentiate yourself from your competitors is by giving news spins to it. It's by giving the human story behind the analysis. It's to give you the different interpretations and analysis of it. So you still need your human interviews and your touch and all of the other nice, kind, compassionate things they wanted on that side. So the point of this debate at the end of the day is this: an increased ethics in journalism is an increased balance of credible, objective information and the human face instead of just the human face of side government. We tell you at the end of the day, the best way to provide journalistic ethics in society is to be able to provide more credible information with more of a human touch rather than prioritizing one over the other. We're very proud to oppose.
Now for the first reply speech, the opposition reply.
Let's come back to the reality of media reporting and how people process news information. Let's start from the perspective of the average news reader trying to understand big and complex issues like poverty in his or her country, like electoral trends in India, things that are sometimes too great for you to understand without the help of the media and news companies. First and foremost, if we put big data into the media to explain such issues, what is it really like for the average viewer? Well, we realize that they have a very mistaken idea of what these news readers are going to see, right? Because what you really see are things like comprehensive data breakdowns, because they want to make the data accessible to you. Only if people truly understand what this data is, will they actually believe it or think that their newspaper is doing a good job with it. You also get subjective analysis of this data. I'm not really sure what they imagined big data and news to be like, right? But what I generally got from them was them saying, oh, maybe a news article will read 85% of people in its countryside profess one political leaning, big data told me so, all is well, the end. That is what they really imagine articles infused with big data to be like. But it is not really like that, right? Big data is the premise from which these articles begin to explore critical and difficult issues. And this data normally comes from large-scale surveys that have been verified. More often than not, usually public surveys and public census, because these are the ones that get the most street cred from the average reader, the average intelligent observer, the average organization. That is really the sort of newspaper articles we are gunning for. So then, how how do we respond to these articles? And that brings me on to my second point. When they came in to us, people question the expert on TV, but not any statistics that show up on TV. That is their main idea of blind fetishization. Let's put it this way, right? As an average news reader, I pay money and spend time to get news magazines and articles to read. So that, because I want, right, to make sense of complex issues around me. That is how we have characterized the average viewer, right? And they fully agree, since they came out and told us that as viewers are able to be skeptical about TV experts, just for some reason, not the news article. And here we see multiple contradictions in their case, right? Because if we all blindly trust data, and yet, if there's really so much data, mistakes, and cherry picking out there, it makes no sense that you would think that I would still trust BBC out of brand loyalty, but not Fox and ABC and CNN when they all say otherwise. So that really doesn't make sense. Another contradiction, if we really believe so strongly in and fetishize data so much, then news companies are all the more inclined to observe what rival companies are doing and crack down on inaccuracies. At the end of the day anyway, right, we're the ones that are more middle ground, because we have shown you from the very start how qualitative and quantitative data go hand in hand. And your quantitative big data facilitates a better qualitative angle when you know where to focus your subjective interviews and investigations on. That entire point and nuance was dropped by their side. Let's go on then to outcomes, right? Because at the end of the day, we all said basically that the media is there to inform and help people understand and check phenomena and developments. Something we trusted from the very start, something that's become the calculus of the debate about media. Well, what is the outcomes under our side? What really helps this average news viewer understand things? Mitra came out and told you, right, that big data is so useful because it allows you to engage with large-scale issues. It allows you to draw links between different variables across long time periods that you may not have been around to see. Furthermore, it gives me, as I pointed out, a toolkit of statistics that big political parties and governments and party organizations often try to use to sway you towards certain viewpoints. But now you have the media agency on your side, bridging the asymmetry of power between yourself and its institutions, helping you really understand what they are saying on their own grounds. So really, the lens of data is great for media because it allows us as average news viewers, average men on the street, to access a skill of complexity that interviews cannot give. And because it gives us an objective premise that are methodological in nature, right, from which we can safely and intelligently spin our opinions. It is therefore the best way to complement the media's aim to inform. For all those reasons, therefore, I believe that big data serves the media best. I'm extremely proud to oppose.
Now for the final speech of the debate, the government slide.
Like big data, it feels like the first two speakers, the side opposition, were really obfuscating the debate, so that we really didn't know what they wanted until their final speaker came out and clarified in whip, right? We think that was really too late and unreasonable. The first two speakers ran this. They ran that we need more objective data and we need more data, therefore big data is good. What was clarified in whip? Was that it is not about using this data or getting more data. It's about the kind of data that comes up and making sure that everybody uses that same body of data, right? We don't think that was really what the problem we set out of today. Neither was it the same problem that they brought up in WHIP, really the same problem as first and second speaker, right? In the same way that what we set up and what they never grappled with was that the fact is the world has evolved today because of the presence of big data within our societies. They wanted to argue for this beautiful world where we could have this nice amalgamation of quantitative and qualitative data within journalism, and we get these lovely news articles when it comes to it, which is why I POI on the motion, right? Because this is a regrets motion. This is a motion in which we have to deal and look at the way that society has happened and been shaped by the fact of big data in the last 10 years, something that will carry down all down the line that they never really wanted to engage with. So two things I'm talking about in my reply. First, how do people view data and how does this then affect the news? And secondly, how does this affect the eventual discourse within society? So how do people view data, right? And this is where they never wanted to deal with the specific nuance we put up here on why is it that data is specifically more harmful than any kinds of qualitative forms of research that which you want to put out there. Because people believe that statistics, in the way that they have sold statistics to be the cold, clear heart objective truth. We denied this from the get-go. We said that it was because people can cherry-pick examples. It is because data, especially big data, is so especially massive that it's so easy for you to be able to cherry-pick all over the place, and it becomes so difficult for anybody to call you out on it because we have already fetishized data to the extent that we believe you cannot argue against data. We told you that what the value we had on our side was that as journalists were to shift back towards going back into subjective human experiences, into putting a human face to that data. It at least means that the people viewing that data are more likely to be able to question this data, right? The second you humanize data, you throw in the possibility that this data could be wrong, rather than presenting those numbers and figures that are seemingly always correct. But how does this affect news corporations, right? Op argue that with more data, you got better news. This is what the first and second speaker said. And our responses were, look, there is no objective truth, right? People and news corporations are only selling this data as such. Viha never really responded to this, instead shifting it to, no, what we want is that they all were to come up with that same pool of data and arrive their analysis from there. I can't really respond to that because it's reply. I can only point out clear case shift, unreasonable for us to expect us to be able to rebut such a thing at this point of time. But more importantly, how does this affect discourse, right? And we need to argue here, compare the two worlds, who really gets more discourse? Because we argue that economics analysis already exists within status quo. That these are data is already there, right? And there are already people analyzing it. We think what was needed was for journalists to fill in that gap that was created because of this fetishization of big data, because of this shift and this trend towards looking only at statistics and analysis and forgetting the very human face that comes with economic policies or social policies they so much wanted to talk about. The fact is, when our policies today are determined only by a set of data and graphs and statistics, and we forget the fact that people are affected by these policies, that's when journalists need to step in. That's where journalists are needed the most. We regret the rise of big data.
I thank both teams for the debate. Please cross the floor, shake hands, and the results will be announced shortly.
Thank you. You want chicken if you chicken?
No, I'm kidding.
Hey, the camera's still running up.
First you diss my PM speech, then you say.
Hey guys, can you move out?
Guys, camera's still running.
Someone want to stop it? So that it doesn't
Just plug it up.
No, it says stop.